Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's legal team have been in contact with the Daily Mail after it republished allegations made in Andrew Lowney's new book entitled
There is a document, 14 pages long, signed in 2018, and buried on page 14, clause 7, is a provision so sweeping, so calculated, that when Princess Anne laid it before the king, the room reportedly went silent. Not the silence of shock, the silence of recognition, the kind where everyone understands simultaneously that something has been happening right in front of them for years, and none of them caught it. Prince Harry, a man who served in the military, buried his mother, walked behind her coffin as the world watched, and poured his trauma into a best-selling memoir, may not legally own any of it. Not the stories, not the interviews, not the documentaries, not even, reportedly, the right to speak publicly about his own childhood without written permission from his wife. It was Princess Anne who uncovered it, quietly, methodically, and apparently devastatingly, pulling back the curtain on what sources are now calling one of the most comprehensive personal control mechanisms ever embedded in a royal-adjacent marriage contract. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what Clause 7 says, what it means for Harry's future, and why experts are now asking the unthinkable. Could Prince Harry walk away from this marriage with nothing? Let's get into it. How did we get here? To understand the full weight of what Princess Anne revealed, you need to understand the world Harry and Meghan were living in when this document was signed. The year was 2018. The wedding had just happened. The public was, for the most part, still enchanted. Meghan Markle had arrived on the royal scene with the kind of energy and narrative momentum that the institution hadn't seen in decades. Young, charismatic, American, and bringing with her the kind of global media attention that made palace communications officers both excited and quietly nervous. But behind the scenes, something else was already being constructed. According to the sources now being cited by royal insiders and legal analysts, by the time Harry and Meghan signed their marital agreement, Meghan had already retained experienced legal counsel. She had, after all, been through this before. Her 2013 divorce from Hollywood producer Trevor Engelson had been handled, by all accounts, with clinical precision. Court observers at the time described her approach as unsentimentally strategic, precise legal maneuvering, clean financial separation, minimal public drama. She walked away clean. Harry, by contrast, was a man who, by his own later admission, had spent much of his adult life in emotional survival mode. Grief-stricken, institutionally dependent, not fully equipped for the commercial and legal complexities of life outside the palace. He was, in the words of those who have analyzed this situation closely, the wrong person to be signing complex intellectual property agreements without independent legal counsel. And that, according to what Princess Anne's investigation has now revealed, is precisely what happened. According to sources with knowledge of the review, Harry reportedly signed the marital agreement, including the now infamous Clause 7, without independent legal representation. Let that sit for a moment. Without independent legal counsel. A man signing away the rights to his own life story, his own memories, his own royal history. And he did it without anyone in his corner whose sole job was to protect him. Princess Anne's investigation, how it started and what she found. The investigation that ultimately exposed Clause 7 did not begin with a dramatic tip-off or a leaked document. It began, according to sources, with a pattern. A series of small observations that, taken individually, might have seemed like normal business decisions, but taken together, painted a picture that alarmed those paying close attention. Princess Anne, known within royal circles for her directness and her intolerance of institutional risk, began noticing something in the financial and legal architecture surrounding the Sussex commercial enterprises. Lady Louise Windsor, younger, digitally fluent, increasingly influential within the court, was tasked with conducting a deeper audit. What she produced, submitted in late January 2026 to the Privy Council, was described by those who read it as stunning in its detail and devastating in its conclusions. The audit mapped what Louise described as a systematic extraction of Meghan's identity, assets, and revenue streams from anything jointly held with Prince Harry, executed with a timeline and precision that spoke not to spontaneous independence, but to deliberate pre-planning. The key findings are worth walking through carefully, because each one tells part of a larger story. American Riviera Orchard, Meghan's lifestyle brand launched in April 2023, was registered as a Delaware LLC, with Meghan listed as the sole owner. Harry's name does not appear in any of the filings. Trademark applications submitted across the United States, the UAE, and Singapore listed no co-ownership and contained no royal references, as if the entire enterprise existed in a legal reality where Harry simply didn't exist. A podcast deal signed in September 2023 named Meghan as sole creative producer and intellectual property holder. Archewell's internal restructuring in July of that same year removed Harry from bank access records and rerouted all content approvals through Meghan's personal legal team. And then Lady Louise found the clause buried in the couple's 2020 Netflix contract. Clause 11C, titled Narrative Rights Transfer Upon Dissolution. It stated plainly that in the event of a marital separation, all jointly produced narrative material would be reviewed by the lead content manager, Meghan Markle. Harry would waive retrospective editorial rights unless granted permission in writing. In other words, if they split, Meghan decides what survives. She decides what gets released, what gets buried, and what gets reframed. By December 2023, as Anne noted during her briefing, Harry had effectively become a silent figure in a brand that depended entirely on his identity. And he reportedly had no idea. Think about that. His name, his face, his story, his trauma, his royal past. All of it being commercially deployed, and the mechanism for doing so was constructed in a way that left him with vanishingly little legal ground to stand on. Clause 7 exposed the most explosive detail, and then came page 14. Clause 7. Originally assumed to be standard prenuptial boilerplate, this clause had gone unexamined, or at least unchallenged, until Lady Louise Windsor cross-referenced its language against California intellectual property law and realized what she was actually reading. The clause granted Meghan Markle full intellectual property rights over all narrative material derived from Harry's personal life. The scope is almost breathtaking in its comprehensiveness. Memoirs, interviews, unpublished letters, documentaries, dramatizations, children's books, even according to the legal analysis, fictionalized reimaginings based on his royal experiences. In plain language, Prince Harry cannot speak, write, publish, or license his own life story without Meghan's written approval. Lady Louise's description of it to the Crown's legal board was blunt. Clause 7 wasn't a legal safeguard, it was a muzzle, signed, sealed, and embedded in law. The timing of its inclusion makes it even more troubling. The clause was embedded in June 2020, just months after Harry and Meghan had stepped back from royal duties and founded Archewell. This was a moment when Harry was, by his own later account, emotionally unmoored, grieving his family relationships, reeling from public pressure, navigating an institutional departure that left him without the structural support the palace had always provided. And it was at that precise moment of maximum vulnerability that the most expansive editorial control clause was reportedly secured. Now ask yourself this question, and I genuinely want you to think about it. Does that timing feel like a coincidence to you? The real-world consequences, once you understand them, are staggering. Harry's memoir, Spare, the book he called his truth, the book the world bought in record numbers, reportedly passed through Meghan's legal approval process. Several chapters were allegedly revised or removed following what sources describe as internal narrative cohesion reviews by her team. If Harry wants to write a follow-up, his own follow-up to his own memoir about his own life, he can't. Not legally, not without Meghan's signature. Legal analysts reviewing the clause confirmed that its reach extended not just to past content, but to future hypothetical portrayals. Harry could not appear in a documentary about his military service without clearance. He could not participate in a mental health initiative referencing his childhood. He could not record a trauma podcast that mentioned his royal upbringing. Even children's stories inspired by his family history would require approval from Meghan's legal team. A BBC legal commentator reviewing the clause stated it was the most comprehensive narrative capture provision ever seen in a celebrity or aristocratic marriage. Essentially, they said, Meghan holds his past, and any profitable version of it, in escrow. One Netflix executive, reviewing the situation internally, allegedly wrote 4 words that have since echoed through every discussion of this story. He's the story, and yet he can't tell it. Anne presents to the King. The summit at Clarence House. On the morning of February 19, 2026, Buckingham Palace issued a statement described by observers as rare and thunderous. The language was constitutional in its register, but unmistakably personal in its intent. No member of the British royal family, past or present, would be commercially leveraged without the consent of the sovereign. Any marital contract attempting to license the monarchy for profit would be reviewed, challenged, and publicly rejected. But behind that public statement lay a private confrontation that had already taken place. A summit at Clarence House, where Princess Anne presented her findings to King Charles and Prince William. By all accounts, Anne was characteristically direct. This was not, she told them, a marital disagreement. This was not the kind of personal drama the palace had weathered many times before. This was, in her words, an architecture of control. Meghan, Anne said, doesn't just own the house. She owns his past and his silence. Lady Louise's contribution to that briefing was equally stark. Meghan's commercial empire, she argued, had never been primarily built on products. It was built on Harry's legacy, his trauma, his royalty, his memory, the lifestyle brand, the podcasts, the Netflix deal, the wellness ventures. All of it derived its value ultimately from Harry's story. And through a series of carefully constructed legal instruments, that story had been transferred piece by piece into Meghan's exclusive control. The dossier presented at the Clarence House Summit was comprehensive. Legal timelines of Meghan's IP and trademark acquisitions, forensic audits of Archewell's corporate structure, a communications history showing Harry's progressive removal from operational and financial decision-making, analysis of Sunshine Sachs, the powerful PR firm Meghan had reportedly re-engaged, and its documented pattern of managing high-profile divorces through what insiders called exit engineering. This was the same team that had managed Katie Holmes' separation from Tom Cruise and Angelina Jolie's narrative positioning during her split from Brad Pitt. They specialize, in the words of one industry observer, in winning not just the divorce, but the public. Princess Anne described Meghan's strategic use of Sunshine Sachs in terms that left no room for diplomatic ambiguity. It's not reputation management. It's premeditated narrative warfare. And then came the most unsettling allegation raised at the summit. Lady Louise told the assembled royals that there were credible reports suggesting intimate footage of Harry's most vulnerable moments, footage filmed for Netflix, was captured not primarily to amplify his voice, but to build a future legal defense. A clause in the Netflix deal titled Couple Alignment and Public Harmony reportedly allowed marital breakdowns to be reinterpreted through pre-approved narrative frames, incompatible values, emotional instability, descriptions that mapped neatly onto Harry's pre-existing tabloid reputation. "This isn't just controlling the message," Louise told them. "This is turning his history into a legal asset, a commodity." The room understood immediately what that meant, and the monarchy began to move. Harry's financial exposure, what he could actually lose. Once you understand Clause 7, the financial picture that surrounds it becomes genuinely alarming. Because the intellectual property question is not the only battlefield here, it is one front in a much wider legal war, and on almost every front, Harry's position appears extraordinarily vulnerable. A confidential legal memo circulated by the Royal Legal Advisory Board outlined the specific risks Harry faces if divorce proceedings begin. The memo, according to those who have reviewed it, makes for difficult reading. The Montecito estate, the grand California property that became the visible symbol of Sussex independence, was financed through joint lending arrangements. Under California's community property laws, which typically split marital assets equally, it could be classified as shared marital property and subject to division. Given the financial challenges already surrounding the couple, a forced sale or buyout could leave Harry without a home. His stake in Archewell is structured, according to the audit, entirely through entities under Meghan's control. His name was removed from bank access records. Content approvals flow through her legal team. In any dissolution proceeding, the question of whether Harry has meaningful claim to any of Archewell's residual value becomes genuinely contested. On the question of his children, Archie and Lilibet, the memo was particularly sobering. Harry's prolonged absences, combined with Meghan's established U.S. residency, create what legal advisors described as tenuous custodial leverage at best. The geographic reality of California family law means that the parent with established local residency and stable presence typically holds significant structural advantage. And then there is the publishing question, which loops back to Clause 7. Harry is legally barred, under the terms of his own signed agreement, from publishing any memoir content tied to his royal past without Meghan's approval. If he wants to tell his story, his own story, after a separation, he would potentially need to either obtain her permission or litigate the clause itself. Both options are expensive, slow, and deeply uncertain. The memo's conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. Harry would be left, as Lady Louise stated bluntly, with his title and his trauma. Nothing more. And the financial pressure was already making itself visible in real ways. Foreclosure notices were filed in Santa Barbara County in February 2026, centered on a $9.4 million bridge loan with a 14.25% interest rate and no grace period. Archewell's podcast division was shuttered. A planned Netflix follow-up documentary was canceled. Their once $40 million content pipeline had evaporated. Their children were moved from a private Brentwood academy to a less expensive program. Meghan's public appearances dwindled. The PR machine went quiet. The empire that was supposed to sustain their independence was collapsing. And Clause 7 meant that Harry's ability to rebuild, to tell his own story, to write, to speak, to license his own memories, was not his to exercise freely. Harry's reaction, the question that broke everyone's heart. There is a moment in this story that transcends the legal complexity and the institutional maneuvering and the financial exposure. A moment that is simply, quietly, heartbreaking. When Harry was briefed on the full implications of what he had signed, when he understood, document by document, the extent to which his narrative, his financial position, and his custodial standing had been structured in ways that disadvantaged him, he reportedly requested a full private review of every contract he had signed since 2020. What he found left him, in the words of one royal secretary, completely hollowed out. He reached out to Prince Edward, not in any official capacity, as a brother, searching, sources say, for clarity, maybe for rescue. He was described by those with knowledge of the communication as shocked, disoriented, and looking for legal ground that had not already been sold out from beneath him. And then, during a private walk on the Sandringham estate, he reportedly turned to Lady Louise Windsor and asked a question that has since circulated among those who heard it, because of how simply and devastatingly it captured his situation. Do my children even count as Windsor anymore? Later, in a private debrief, he allegedly told Princess Anne something that encapsulated everything. I signed to protect her, but I never thought I'd have to protect myself from what I signed. Anne's response, according to those present, was characteristic. No comfort, no reassurance, just clarity. Then let this be the chapter where you take your name back. The question I want to ask you, and I want your honest answer in the comments, is this. Do you think Harry knew? Do you believe he understood what he was signing? Or do you think he is genuinely a man who trusted completely and paid an enormous price for that trust? Because the answer to that question changes everything about how we understand this story. The monarchy responds from concern to counterattack. Once the full picture was laid before King Charles, Anne, and William, the palace moved from quiet concern to what sources described as a coordinated institutional counterstrike. And the scale of that response tells you everything about how seriously the monarchy took what had been revealed. On February 15th, King Charles ordered a rarely invoked emergency measure, biometric vaulting of all unreleased footage, images, and voice recordings related to Archie and Lilibet. This covered not just palace portraits, but Netflix footage, home videos, and unreleased podcast audio stored under the Archewell brand. The stated purpose was to prevent identity exploitation in future AI models, merchandise, or dramatized content. The Lord Chamberlain's office issued a formal addendum to an earlier deroyalization order. Archie and Lilibet would no longer be associated with privileges, protections, or ceremonial references attached to the British Crown. All licensing for commemorative materials featuring the children, porcelain, books, archival prints, digital assets, was revoked. U.S. retailers were notified to halt Sussex-linked merchandise referencing royal birthright. On February 16th, King Charles enacted what was described as a sovereign decree of narrative reclamation, the first time in modern royal history that the monarchy formally declared a private contract incompatible with crown continuity. Any commercial platform, post-marital arrangement, or private endeavor seeking to capitalize on Harry's name, likeness, or historical experience would be void of crown recognition unless ratified by sovereign authority. And then, on February 18th, the palace published a single line on the royal family's official website. Calm, precise, and in its own way, extraordinary. The Windsor legacy shall not be licensed. It shall be lived. It was, as one commentator put it, the most elegant institutional response in recent memory. Not an attack, not a scandal, a sovereign declaration that some things are not for sale. Catherine's move, the shield and the image. In the midst of all this legal and institutional maneuvering, one moment stood out for its symbolic power, and it involved the Princess of Wales. Catherine, who has maintained notable public silence on Sussex matters for years, navigating that silence with the kind of careful dignity that has come to define her public persona, made a calculated, visible move on February 14th. She appeared at a children's welfare event in West London, wearing a navy coat and a delicate rose gold brooch. The brooch, royal observers quickly confirmed, was a new insignia representing the Windsor Protection Protocol, recently invoked to shield royal minors from unauthorized media use. When asked about recent developments, her reply was brief and precisely chosen. Every child deserves a life free from exploitation. The Crown stands ready to protect that right wherever it's challenged. It was not a personal attack on Meghan. It was not a defense of Harry. It was something more deliberate than either. An institutional statement, delivered through the person who currently represents the future of the British monarchy most powerfully, about what the Crown will and will not permit to happen to children associated with it. And then, the following morning, came the image that many observers said closed the chapter more effectively than any legal document could. Catherine stood on the steps of a children's advocacy center, holding the hands of George and Charlotte. And beside them, shyly, in a navy blue coat with a matching headband, was Lilibet. No press release, no questions permitted, one wide shot, and a caption published quietly by the palace. A story doesn't belong to those who write it, it belongs to those who live it. The monarchy had made its move. Not with scandal, with sovereignty. Meghan's silence and what it means. Throughout all of this, the palace statements, the legal maneuvers, the public imagery, the documented financial collapse, Meghan Markle has said almost nothing. Sunshine Sachs, the firm described by Princess Anne as specialists in premeditated narrative warfare, issued no statements. Archewell's website remained static. A scheduled Zoom appearance at a global wellness summit was cancelled, citing scheduling conflicts. No new social media posts were shared during the peak of the institutional response. There was one exception, a video released from Montecito. The aesthetic was carefully constructed, ivory decor, flickering candles, soft piano. The tone was intimate. She spoke of truth and resilience, and a woman's voice being erased. It was released just hours after the foreclosure papers went public. The timing was noted. The hashtag narrative hostage trended globally. American networks began asking questions they had not previously been willing to ask. Was Harry a supporting character in a pre-scripted memoir? Had his life been optioned out like a Netflix miniseries? The silence from Meghan's team since that video has been, in its own way, louder than any statement. When a communications operation as sophisticated as Sunshine Sachs goes quiet in the middle of a developing story, it is rarely because they have nothing to say. It is usually because they are making calculations about what the safest move is. And sometimes, the safest move is to say nothing and wait. But waiting has its own costs. Every day that passes without a public response from Meghan is a day the narrative is being built by other people, by palace statements, by royal experts, by the legal documents themselves. And as we have already seen in this story, whoever controls the narrative controls a great deal more than the public perception. They control the legal and commercial landscape as well. The bigger picture, what this means for everyone. Let us take a moment to look at what this story actually represents, beyond the specifics of one marriage and one set of legal documents. At its core, the Clause 7 revelation raises a question that goes far beyond the Sussex household. It asks, in the modern era, when personal narrative has become one of the most commercially valuable assets a person can possess, what happens when the rights to that narrative are transferred through private contract? And what are the responsibilities of institutions, whether monarchies or legal systems or media platforms, when they discover that such transfers have occurred? The British monarchy's response has been, in historical terms, extraordinary. For an institution that prides itself on not engaging directly with personal disputes involving its members, the directness of the palace's intervention, the legal memos, the decrees, the biometric vaulting, the official website updates, signals that this was not seen as a private family matter. It was seen as an institutional threat, a precedent that, if left unchallenged, could reshape the relationship between the Crown and its members' personal histories in ways that the monarchy was simply not prepared to accept. From Harry's perspective, the emerging picture is of a man who genuinely believed he was building something new, a life of independence, of meaning, of impact, and who may now be confronting the possibility that the architecture of that life was not built for his benefit, that the independence was, in crucial legal ways, illusory, that the narrative of his own liberation was itself being managed and controlled. And from a purely human standpoint, setting aside the royal titles and the legal clauses and the palace statements, this is a story about trust, about what happens when you trust someone completely, without the independent counsel or structural protection that might have helped you understand what you were agreeing to. What comes next? The questions that remain unanswered. As of February 2026, this story is unresolved. The legal processes are underway. the palace has drawn its lines. Harry is reportedly in a Windsor residence, reviewing documents and asking questions that suggest a man preparing to make significant decisions about his future. But there are questions that nobody has yet been able to answer definitively, and they are the questions that will determine how this chapter ends. Will Harry challenge Clause 7 in court? The legal avenue exists, theoretically. A contract signed without independent counsel, under conditions of emotional vulnerability, containing provisions of this scope, could potentially be contested. But litigation is slow, expensive, and public. Everything would come out. Every document, every financial record, every private communication. Is that a price Harry is willing to pay? What happens to Archie and Lilibet? The children are now at the center of a genuinely complicated legal and institutional situation. The palace's removal of their names from official records, combined with the custodial questions raised by California family law and Harry's extended absences, creates a situation of real uncertainty about their futures. And what does Meghan do next? Her silence cannot last indefinitely. Sunshine Sachs will eventually have a strategy. A statement will come. A positioning will be made. The question is whether, by the time it arrives, the legal and narrative ground will have shifted so fundamentally that no amount of PR craftsmanship can recover what has been lost. The palace has said the Windsor legacy shall not be licensed, but licensing has already occurred. Documents have already been signed. Money has already moved. The decree of reclamation is a declaration of intent, but intent and legal outcome are not the same thing, and the courts of California do not take instructions from Buckingham Palace. Here is where we stand. A document. 14 pages, signed in 2018. A clause on page 14 that allegedly gave one person control over another person's life story, memories, and public voice. Signed, according to sources, without independent legal counsel. An investigation conducted quietly by Princess Anne and Lady Louise Windsor that exposed not just the clause, but an entire financial architecture constructed around Harry's identity while systematically removing him from its ownership and control. A man who served his country, who grieved publicly, who trusted completely, now reportedly confronting the possibility that he could walk away from his marriage without his home, without meaningful custodial leverage over his children, without the ability to publish his own story, and without the financial independence that was supposed to justify everything he gave up. And an institution, ancient, adaptive, and evidently furious, that has decided it will not allow royal history to become, in Princess Anne's words, a subscription service. The story is not over, not even close. But the questions it raises are ones that apply far beyond the walls of any palace or the specifics of any marriage contract. Who owns your story? Who has the right to your memories? And what are you willing to sign away in the name of love or trust without fully understanding what you are giving up? I want to know what you think. Do you believe Harry was genuinely unaware of what Clause 7 contained? Do you think the monarchy's response goes too far, or not far enough? And do you believe Meghan's silence right now is strategy, or something else entirely? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The conversation happening underneath this video matters, because this is a story that is still being written, and the next chapter could arrive at any moment. If you found this video valuable, share it with someone who has been following the Sussex story. Subscribe if you haven't already. And keep watching, because the document drops, the legal filings, and the palace responses are far from finished. The Windsor legacy, the palace says, shall be lived, not licensed. But somewhere in California, a pen is still being held. And the question of who writes the next line is very much unanswered.